You're listening to Lunchtime here on News Talk. Shane Coleman with you this afternoon. Now, what comes to mind when you think of Michael D. Higgins? Poet, intellectual, Galway socialist, the arts. Many simply think of him as the oldest presidential candidate, but there's a lot of things about him that rarely get mentioned these days. He's a Clare man, a farm boy, a leading member of the Legion of Mary in Galway. The list goes on. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been profiling the presidential candidates and their background and record, and today we're going to look at Michael D. And joining us to do this is Michael Clifford, journalist covering the presidential election for the Irish Examiner. Good afternoon, Michael.
Hi, Shane.
Now, if you were describing Michael D. Higgins to somebody who'd come to this country in the middle of the presidential election, said, like, what's this man about? How would you sum him up?
I suppose you'd sum him up as a political intellectual, which is a sort of a rare species. Indeed, he'd also, I'm sure he would define himself as being a socialist as well. He would always have been viewed as being of something of the left, of the Labour Party. And I suppose in that vein, the presidency, from the point of view of his party, is an ideal job for Michael D. in that he would have huge admiration within the party because he would be regarded as somewhat radical. Yet at the same time, I doubt if they'd ever have elected him leader on the basis that he is a bit radical. But therefore, a job like the presidency, which is largely symbolic, I think they would be delighted to see him in there because he couldn't do their electoral chances any harm. Yes, as I say, they'd very much admire him and they'd like to see him in a role like that.
Mick, there's a great story about Michael D. Higgins from the early 1980s. There was a major crisis going on in the Labour Party, and it was a meeting summoned. All the TDs were summoned to it, but Michael D. Higgins was absent, and apparently he was at a meeting on some emergency mission in the Middle East. And Frank Kluski very caustically commented that he said, trust Michael D. Higgins. Given the choice between saving the world and saving the Labour Party, he took the easy option. He has that reputation, doesn't he, as someone who's a campaigner, Nicaragua, El Salvador, those kind of causes.
Very much so. And again, that is a thing that an awful lot of people who would see themselves as being liberal or on the left would have huge time for. But the realpolitik of it is that it's unlikely they would ever have elected him leader, certainly in the last, 25 years or so, as that type of politics drifts more towards the centre. But most definitely held in the highest esteem. He's also a published poet. He's published 4 or 5 books of poetry. In fact, I think it's interesting in the official polling notice in the newspapers, he's down as lecturer poet. So quite obviously he considers that role, that aspect of his career to be quite significant himself.
He's been accused at times of being a little bit pretentious. Is that fair?
Well, I suppose you could accuse anybody who's something of an intellectual of being a bit pretentious from time to time. I mean, he had a very difficult childhood. Not in that he grew up in some poverty. His father was a Republican. He fought on the Republican side in the Civil War and lost his job as a result. And his health deteriorated after that, and I think there were some very straitened circumstances growing up, and he was actually reared by an aunt in County Clare, and he then he was involved in the Legion of Mary, and it was there he met a man, I think it was Redmond Corbett, who was a man who was very well known for being a man of great substance in the Galway early in particular, was so impressed by him that he gave him a loan to go to college, and I think he was a few years above the normal age of going to college. He was about 21, and he got his education that way, and in UCG he was actually in the Fianna Fáil coming. Then he met Noel Brown, whose own early life, I suppose, in some ways would have mirrored Michael D's own, and it was that that attracted him into the Labour Party, and from there he graduated to he's now effectively a grandee of the party. I mean, he has, and people say about pretension, they also talk about, his manner, his high-pitched voice and have you. Tough operator too. It's not that easy to hold on to your seat over there in Galway he lost it once, I think, down through the last 30-odd years, so he knows his politics too.
He does, and he has a pretty decent track record in terms of, he was a minister between 1992 and 1997. Des O'Malley famously said he'd go mad in office, and to be fair to him, he didn't. He was a very good minister.
Very good minister, and particularly to do with the arts. The arts community would hold him in the highest esteem. He did great things, and particularly in the development of the film board when he was in there. And he was very much seen as a friend of the arts. And the general consensus after his term was that he'd acquitted himself extremely well in there. As you say, some people would have thought that he might go a bit crazy there, but he showed that he's well able for the whole business of holding a cabinet portfolio at the time.
Now, Mick, you followed his campaign. Just tell us about the kind of message he's trying to get across. He's trying to, at least certainly up until today and yesterday, to stay above the fray at all times.
Yes, he's very much trying to stay above the fray. I mean, like a lot of the stuff that has come out about the other candidates largely are because we don't know that much about them, whereas Michael D, because he's been in public life, similar to Gay Mitchell, I suppose, there's very little, you might say, to be dug up from their past. And he has stayed above the fray. He's, for instance, by contrast with Gay Mitchell, he has made no attacks on Martin McGuinness's own record and the belief among practically everyone in the country that he isn't telling the truth about his time in the IRA. So he stayed above the fray. He's tried to project the image of somewhat elder statesman, with no emphasis on the elder, but somebody who knows the Constitution, who is very au fait with the very constitutional specifics of the job, and somebody who'd be well able to represent the country in that vein. He has continually gone back to the constitutional position of the job. He's made, the odd kind of disparaging comment. He made one reference to, it was seen as a reference to Sean Gallagher. This was before Gallagher's meteoric rise in recent weeks, about saying that, he wasn't going to be the Minister for Enterprise, because Sean Gallagher has made a lot of emphasis on the whole area of business. So he's been very much adopting the statesman role about the job.
And on the campaign trail, is he good with people on the ground?
He is. I mean, I was out with him there at the weekend. He's good. He's nothing fantastic, nothing inspirational, but he is. He's a very natural ability with people, and he's a very good listener. And as well, I mean, he's very quick to emphasise to anybody who brings up issues that there'll be no policy involved in the job. Also, anytime mentions anything to do with the current economic crisis, he's very quick and very understandably so to point out that as a member of the Labour Party himself, he spoke against the bank guarantee and he voted against it. But he's a good campaigner without being anything spectacular.
Just very briefly, Mick, you were talking about him sort of staying above the fray, but it's noticeable over the last day or two that has changed. Very much clearly speaking about Sean Gallagher when he spoke about candidates promising things they can't deliver and talking about the legacy of the Celtic Tiger. Is he getting a little bit rattled, do you think?
Oh, I would say definitely. I mean, I think there would have been a certain consensus out there, certainly among the media for the last 3 weeks anyway, that it was Michael Dees to lose. And now we see the poll at the weekend that he is effectively losing it. I would think that himself and his supporters would have been under the impression it was as steady as you go, and he'd sail on in that kind of way. Now it seems he'll have to get the gloves off. He'll have to do something in order to haul back in the popularity of Sean Gallagher, and it'll be interesting to see what he do. He's already sort of half suggested a head-to-head debate with Sean Gallagher. Whether Mr. Gallagher will go for that is another matter. But he's definitely, after seeing, it seems now that he certainly won't get the job by default, which might have been the case prior to this weekend. So it'll be interesting to see how he addresses it. Has to be said, I mean, he's a man of 70 years of age, and I saw him on Saturday, and he has an awful lot of energy. He was out campaigning the previous day. He was up around Donegal, Derry, down all day out on Saturday, and he certainly knows he's in a battle now, so it'll be very interesting to see how he addresses that.
OK, we'll leave it there. Mick Clifford covering the presidential election for the Irish Examiner. Thanks for joining us, and Mick will be joining us again in the coming days going through the various presidential candidates.